Good evening from Angewandte Innovation Lab. My name is Bärbel Müller. I'm co-curating the exhibition Ecologies and Politics of the Living, which is part of the Vienna Biennale for Change 2021. My co-curators are Elisabeth Falkensteiner from AIL Angewandte and the artist Ibrahim Mahama. So we are delighted to have this first artist talk here, and it's a pleasure to have Ibrahim and Tracy in Vienna. So I would like to start introducing Tracy Thompson. Tracy Naa Koshie Thompson, born 1993 in Ghana, is an artist living and working in Accra and KUMASI. So she holds a master in fine arts, and she went through the school of caricature Seidu, who somehow was, but you will talk about him later most probably, who somehow educated a new exciting generation of artists in Ghana. And Tracy is interested in processual art, and the material of her work is processed food, and we will talk about that in detail later. I would also like to warmly welcome Ibrahim Mahama. Ibrahim Mahama is a Ghanaian artist living and working in Tamale, Kumasi and Accra. Ibrahim received international visibility through his massive jute bag projects, which have been exhibited at like 3 Venice Biennales, at Documenta 14, Sydney Biennial 2020, and many other locations. And what is also important to mention is that he's not only a practicing architect, but very interested in institution building and in changing the educational sector and the arts scene in Ghana, especially in Tamale at the moment. Yes, I somehow forgot to mention all the exhibitions you participated in. At the moment, Tracy's work is on show in Denmark and in France, and you exhibited intensely all over Ghana, but also at the Stellenbosch Biennale in South Africa. I would like to shortly talk about the topic of this exhibition, which, as I mentioned, I co-created with Elisabeth Falkensteiner and Ibrahim Mahama. So we felt that we would like to contribute to the overall topic of the Biennial, which is planet love, climate care in the digital age, from a non-Western perspective, and also we were interested in narratives which are not necessarily solution-oriented, but question relations between the past and the future, and we were interested in exploring narratives on coexistence and cohabitation, the relationship of the built environment, nature, humans, and organic and inorganic material. So I think it's interesting to somehow start from the pieces which are on show in the exhibition. And I would like to start with you, Ibrahim, that you talk a bit about the work we are sitting in front of. So what we see here is one of your very recent collages, and there is a lot to talk about that, and so I hand over the mic to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Bärbel. Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here, particularly in this moment of crisis, that the world is in. So we don't take it lightly. I think that it's such an important event, and also I'd like to say thank you to all the people who've made this exhibition possible, including the students and workers and technicians and everyone. I guess when we started having a conversation regarding this exhibition, I guess you were in Tamale, and we were looking through maybe things in a studio, and also talking about the possibility of, for instance, making this collage, because I was experimenting with some forms in red clay. This piece titled "The Whole World" is actually it's part of a body of work I've been making for the last I think in my notebook for the last 3-4 years, but I've never really made it on a scale like this. It's always only stayed in my notebook because I spend a lot of time making notes and just focusing on that as notes. But in the last couple of months, I decided to make these large drawings or pieces out of it, and they're basically inspired by my research into architecture, specifically the silos that I've been researching around Ghana, and also some of the materials I've been collecting, like the archival materials from like the post-independent factories and Krumas factories that were never finished or that were working and they were later bankrupted or something. I guess I'm more interested in creating this kind of new visual language or material out of the work, my praxis itself. So as compared to the earlier works where I would sew the jute sacks together in order to create these giant tapestries, I'm more or less interested in coming back down now into looking at things a lot more closely, but this time around using, let's say, the imageries of the sites that I would have used, like the buildings, as subject matter again in the collage. So previously I would sew the jute sacks and I would cover these buildings which I thought there was a relationship to be made. But this time around I photographed the buildings, because even in the period when I was doing the jute stack installations, I was photographing these sites extensively. For instance, this is the top of the silo in Ho, which I photographed with a drone in 2018. But I've never used the image until just recently, because I keep going back into the archives that I have, and sometimes I take some aspects of it, because the more you look at it, the more you realize that when you multiply it, it begins to create a new pattern. And also, when I discovered the bats down the silo in Tamale, and how they were somehow hanging together in all these multiple forms, that was what gave me this idea. But what would it be if you made a series of collages or drawings that somehow made the bats to somehow be appearing out of it? Because in the case of the bats, they don't come out in daylight, except if they're like advanced vampires who are coming to take over the earth in a way. But I like that. I watch a lot of movies and like I read comics and all that, and I like this idea that we can bring fiction into it, but also a certain kind of fiction which can almost be real, because the pandemic has taught us that humankind is very fragile, and also we have to like really take time to pay attention to the current ecological crisis within the world. So I guess this work, the whole world, somehow is almost like a question of what happens if humanity doesn't slow down and there is an apocalypse. Yeah, so that's about it.
I mean, for me, it's particularly interesting that in your previous works, it was a lot about the politics of labor and the notion of labor in all its consequences, and also like in all its historic implications in a independent Ghana, and so it was very human-centered, and there was this huge interest in the accumulation of material and also in architecture and space. And now it's more recently that this idea came in, that they also, like through the silo most probably, that there is this co-inhabitation. Could you talk a bit about this transition from the jute bag works, which were so much about like involving people thinking about the notion of work, and how that shifted in your recent making also, or like institution building in Tamale?
Yeah, with regards to this one, I guess when we were exhuming the silo in Tamale, because there was the silo in Tamale is called Nkrumah Volne. And the Volne in our language in Dagbani actually means inside the hole, but it could also mean the idea of pulling or excavating something. But the idea of there is a potential. It's an interesting word. It's like an idea of potential within failure. It's like you see the failure, but potential is attached to failure in some sense. And when we started the excavation process, we discovered that there were a lot of like microorganisms, because we had a scientist who came to test the soil and the water down there, and there were so many microorganisms within the building, you know, and also there were bats in the building that were multiplying. There were snakes in the building, there were toads in the building, there were snails in the building. So when we were excavating the building, for me it was really important to be able to imagine that the ecological system that had grown in the building had come to really somehow protect or like protects the space, because it had created a new aura within the building. And as an artist, you could only dream about creating things like that, because we're always claiming of trying to produce work that somehow looks at life and all that. But I thought that was just life in itself that was down there. So during the process, because it was labor intensive, we spent several months, almost close to a year, excavating, exhuming the site, only to be able to like present it as a gift back to the community in an institutional building manner. But for me, it was very important to somehow be able to focus on the life forms that were in the building, and to be able to learn from the way that these forms were organized within the spaces, to see how we could somehow create, for that to somehow inform us in the way that we thought about like occupying like institutional space. So one of the decisions that was made was to use the exhumed soil from the space as memory cubes in the Parliament of Ghosts in red clay. So not throwing it away, because traditionally, if you're an archaeologist excavating or exhuming a site, you're more interested in the object that comes after the exhumation. But the soil itself, I thought, was very important as an ecological thing. And then secondly, also, the idea was to somehow convert the building into like a greenhouse. And thirdly, also, there was a part of the building, this inverted pyramid, that we had to seal off, and we had to transfer all like the fishes and the toads into that part. So we kept every life form that was in the building right within it. And for me, it's very important as an artist to be able to make this shift, because I think the world is so centered on like everything is, the human being is all thinks that it's like the center of the universe. Yet we know that even 90% of the universe is dark, is black, is a void. Yeah. And the rest of the 10% is probably like trillions of galaxies, which we cannot even begin to fathom. So the idea is somehow to constantly be able to come back to this notion of exploring the void, the silo as a void of these many multitudes. Because when we convert it into an institution by bringing this, the coffin with the mummy or the Sputnik, which from the collection of the Ghana Museum, it almost creates this kind of singularity. And I've explored that in recent work, for instance, in red clay with Ernest Sakite, who is my colleague there, that we've been teaching the kids the drones of combining, let's say, older technologies and newer technologies. I think I find it very interesting that when you combine different things from very different time eras and ideological values and all that, there begins to be some kind of a clash, which I think that can be referred back to like in astronomical terms, like a singularity, in a way that allows for a certain kind of black hole to emerge. It can be full of crisis in itself, but for me, I think that's where my interest is in, that within that moment when it opens, the void opens and it begins to suck things in, maybe there is a promise, there is some kind of another multiverse somewhere which it can lead our imaginations to. And so this drawing leads back into that that idea.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that it's considered it was considered an unfinished abundant structure, and in how you read it or explored it, it turned out to not be abundant at all. Yeah. And that's quite interesting. And then also this idea of the translocation, like that you somehow appropriate an existing structure, and elsewhere in Tamale you build new structures, and you have these translocations of materials which are alive. Yeah. So Tracy, I think we continue with you now. Unfortunately, we cannot move to the other end of the space where you could see Tracy's work. Can we have an image of one of her works? So Tracy, can you talk about what we see here in Vienna?
Okay, thank you. I would also like to thank the entire team, the students of the school, and also to Ibrahim as well for inviting me. I wouldn't be here if not for you. And thanks so much, for making it possible despite, it's being COVID and the challenges of coming here. So thank you. So for this, for this show, is the work I presented is titled Wache's Polymer Ecology. And for me, one interesting thing that caught me was honestly the title. Yes, when you mentioned about ecology and forms and of course intersections of species and what could erupt from uncontrolled systems and all of that. And for me, I've been working with food for some time now, and in looking at many of the characters of materials, in materials at times you have some that maybe will be classified as maybe thermophilic or hydrophilic, like love for heat and all of that. And I've been dealing with plastics, and it has that character. And Wache has a sense of fragility to it that for me...
Can you shortly explain to the Austrian audience what Wache is?
Sorry. Okay, so Wache, it says local food in Ghana is made of rice and beans, and usually cooked with sorghum leaves. That gives it sorghum bicolor leaves, so it has this reddish brown color to it. Yes, that we used to cook the rice and beans. So that's basically Wache. Yeah, so I came all the way here in Austria to cook Wache here and to post-produce it. And this exhibition presented an opportunity. This is my first time exploring my work more in terms of the process, to have the process and the generation of the form of the work in the space. Usually my works, by the time an audience interacts with it, it's a finished work or something. But it's interesting to have the work in this process where it begins to crack, the smell and all of that being parts of the exhibition. And it keeps changing and it's still ongoing. So these are the things that forms part of what the audience would encounter, of course. And yes, Ibrahim mentioned something about the unfinished, and I think it's all connected all together, because the unfinished really presents a very radical opportunity when it comes to looking at a certain form where not just the obstruction of human agency, but where at a certain point of course there is that trigger where the human does not necessarily have that full central charge of all the various elements of the work, and these are things that we encounter all the time and could take for granted, even heat or humidity and all of that. And putting up the show with Francois' work, even the challenges that comes with all these things, which for me are possibilities to how forms, geological forms and all of that could be parts of the work, not necessarily the finished work. So that is yes, the work that we find in the show. Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about, I mean, you use processed food as the material to do your installative and processual art. Could you talk a bit more about what food means to you? That is one interesting thing. And then the other, for me, it's also interesting that you on the one hand work with processed fresh food, but also in industrially produced food, such as Danish cookies or Indomie noodles, that you dig a bit deeper into explaining what that means to you.
Okay, yes. When it comes to when it comes to food, usually in art, probably maybe it will be, put into a category of still life or something, or maybe it's presented in its entire form. But I'm looking at food for me, food becomes just like plastics. Plastics implies, the kind of form that is like a substitution of many things. So even in the how do you call it, the material possibilities of plastics, humans, fibers, polymers. Polymers are everything, actually, literally everything. Not just the materials of hair or shoes or bottles or anything, but microbes and many other species. And for me, whether bioplastics already presents that interesting, how do you call it, plasticity deals with that interesting paradox of bio and synthetic, that it's often, very blurry, because at what point does a thing become artificial? Even if we are to take, I started working with petroleum based, that was my early experimentations, petroleum based, plastics, styrofoam, or what they call polystyrene. Yes, and of course these are decayed, how do you call it, these are sourced from decayed matter of dinosaurs and plants for millions of years. And it's not like humans invented fermentation and decomposition and all of those things, but these are things we encounter and all of that. And at what point does it become artificial and toxic? But this is from nature. When it comes to back to nature, then it becomes toxic and all of that. So plasticity, in this kind of idea of molding, it's always becoming, it's not fixed. That kind of notion really perpetuates the idea of that kind of blurring of these lines between artificial or natural or whatever. So in many of my experimentations, I started dealing with using some of these ultra processed foods, like the Danish book butter cookies that I'm currently showing in Arus, then rube, which still with the fufu and mixed with sobolo. And because it's food and processes, that could be hybrids, there are all these possibilities with it. And plastics also come with that kind of ambiguity. You can never tell if I am using the natural or the artificial. At that point, it doesn't even make sense. It just comes in a certain ambiguous form. Any audience interacting my work will not know if whether it's made of wache or not, whether it's natural. So these are the challenge, like the interesting things about working with plasticity as a material in its processes and what it also offers historically. Yes.
Yeah, you also talk a lot about the notion of mutation, and to me it's also somehow related to the notion of contamination, which was interesting to us when we researched for this exhibition, that this is like a moment in time in an Anthropocenic or even in a time where we aim for post-Anthropocenic solutions, to look at like what is there now and not dream back of this notion of nature and the build and the human and the animated, inanimated as separate, but it's basically all interrelated. And can you talk a bit about this idea of mutation and contamination?
Okay, yes, that's very interesting. For instance, like in dealing with something like ecology, in its etymology comes from the word oikos, which is like habituation. There's a bit of thing about it, because habituation ends up as if environment or ecology, it's an outside. And when dealing with mutation, inside and outside already like intermingled together. That's how come in titling the work I use polymer, because polymer really is very interesting. And in the kind of processes of mutation that I'm adapting in the work through microbial fermentation processes and all of that, it's also synonymous to what occurs in the human body. It's completely synonymous. It's not even like so far off. The same lactic acids that is in our bones and all of that is the same acids that how do you call it they are the same enzymes that the bacteria is producing when we are fermenting it with sugars and all of that. Is entirely the same thing. So that outside and inside and all of that, that kind of plasticity between those ideologies already is implied in these kind of notions I'm dealing with, and of course with the kind of materials that are being engaged. And that is how come in these processes of mutation, ambiguity is also implied, because you're creating mutants as well. And for me, that is the interesting point of which post-production really becomes an interesting dynamic, and also not the idea of just presenting food as it is, but also a certain form of altering, a certain form of synthesizing, a certain form of like reverse engineering and all of that. And in that moment of mutation and all of that, you deal with that's uncontrolled mechanisms and all of those things that comes into these kind of processes, for me, which is very important. That is how come usually at times I might not present a long text about what the material necessarily is. Maybe the title will suggest it or not. So this is how I work with those ideas of mutations. But I'm also very particular, as you could see, and not only in the symbolic notion of mutation, but also dealing with the actual chemical processes of mutation, which of course I wouldn't take for granted as an artist, because it's also vital, in which artists are not only just changing the things from just the outside or the facade, but could also change things from the inside out. And that is what I'm dealing with when it comes to my work with mutations of foods. So in the end, it might not necessarily be food. It doesn't need to be consumed by humans. It could be toxic to humans and so on, or it could even invite insects and all of that.
Thank you. Like you talked about reverse engineering, and that brings me back to your work. Ibrahim, can you talk a bit about your idea of reverse engineering, which I see a lot in your aim in having these time-space continuum and looking into the past or looking into the last century, but that also, of course, goes further backward and into the future?
I guess that started with the institutional building when I started working on SCCA Red Clay. And I guess the idea of technology also played a very important part of it. In 2000 and I think it was 2018 when I got the first aircraft from Accra to Tamale. Of course, at the time, the idea was I was thinking of it as some kind of pedagogical space, like a classroom or something like that. But then the Parliament of Ghosts happened. The idea of using the materials, the archives that I had collected from the railways and like post-independent institution like the one in this work, and building this Parliament of Ghosts. And then after the Parliament, that's when the idea of the silo became a bit more strong and important. So for me, it was very important. Of course, the years before, I was using a lot of drone in my work, photographing buildings and spaces, and also looking at the relationship between the buildings I was working with in relation to the city and how people move around. So the idea has always been to be able to be inspired by spaces, objects, conditions of another time and generation, and be able to use that to be able to create things in the present and allow the present to be able to go back in the past to be able to change or affect things materially. And in the case of the silo, it's one of those that in 2015, when I did the exchanger with the jute sacks covering the silo in Accra, several years later, I'm able to use that idea of the jute sacks to be able to create a space like, let's say, red clay, and it was an SCCA, and the red clay and SCCA were the only reason why it was possible for us to be able to save the silo. Yeah, and it's the same with, let's say, teaching the kids how to fly drones using the cockpit of the airplane, because at the end of the day, one might ask the question, what is so important about using the cockpit or the fuselage of the airplane? But there is something about it, because the fuselage of the airplane or the cockpit is not the outside world, or it's not a traditional classroom. It's not even the parliament. It provides a different set of constellations. And of course, these cockpits that we're using are coming from the last, let's say, 2 generations. And the drones are like really modern, like technologies that we are using in relation to, let's say, VR, so virtual reality, augmented reality, and things like that. And I thought it's very important because it allows us to be able to time travel in ways that would have not been possible some decades ago. And it's important for the current generation to be able to do that, to be able to introduce the element of time travel within the way they think, because it's important for your brain as a human being to be able to go back and forth in between time. I don't think if we had the chance to be able to go back and forth in between time, to be able to be watchers or witnesses of time or the way the earth has evolved, we would make the choices or the decisions that we're making today. Because we can all agree that in the last 200 years, we have done more damage to the world than it has been in the last 4 billion years that it's existed. So for me, that is very important, particularly when an artist decides that he's going to exercise freedom in producing, then you actually have to exercise freedom without any sense of fear or anything holding you back. So I think sometimes we just have to almost be like mad scientists in a way. And if you have an idea which even goes beyond the thinkable, you just try it and see what possibilities arise out of it. And it might, as Tracy said, it's not always meant to work out. Sometimes it might collapse, it might fail. But I think the promise of our generation or of the time that we live in is that there is a lot to learn from failure. It's not to shy away from, because the moment we deny failure, it's almost as if we are denying truth. And when you deny truth, there can't be any sense of progress in the world, because you really have to understand that, okay, fine, this is where we are and this is where we can be. At least you are self-aware and about not the destination per se, but about a certain kind of trajectory. And it happens to be that globally, we are having more and more generations who are born, because now the world is so sophisticated with technology. But then again, you're having more and more young people who are dumber than it was in the previous generation. Of course, it's interesting because they're able to do a lot more, and now their brains are a lot more sophisticated in the way they can connect things. But I think that there are some nuances and subtleties which are lost within our time. And if we are not able to harness it by slowing down and really looking at things closely, it might be a much bigger disaster than it was in the centuries that the disasters of the centuries that we inherited. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it would be interesting now to, for the audience also not being familiar with the art scene in Ghana, like that you both talk a bit about, like on the one hand, again, like this necessity of institution building and education as a kind of care and also as a kind of ecology of the living. Like maybe Tracy, you start in talking about your educational background and like the ideas and maybe even ideologies of the group of artists or generation of artists you belong to.
This is a very broad question because a lot has been done. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I studied in KNUST. That was starting from 2013. That was when I first encountered Dr. Caricature Seidu, George Amprichum, Castro, Mr. Kisedu, and yes, and many of their thinking have really shaped us a lot. And of course, okay, talking about institution building and all of that, of course, coming into like the when it comes to the art scene in Ghana, previously, art was just about, creating objects, then you are done at the end of the day. But we're presented in much more thinking beyond just objects, but also community, and also making use of what we have. People might think that probably maybe because Ghana or Africa lack of infrastructure, resources, or blah blah blah, so we cannot produce or make art. But that's rather presented much more great opportunities to discover, to not necessarily create institutions that how do you call it, are patterned after what is already there, but to learn from failures, learn from so many different models, but to also expand the notion of institution, to expand the notion of community. That at the end of the day, even what blaxTARLINES is trying to do is not just to expand even art, but it enters like when you are dealing with ecology and all of that. It's not something that is within a certain isolation or a box, and art presented that form in which it could expand into different fields and all of that. And looking at Ibrahim Mahama and what he has started in SCCA in Tamale. Many many artists will never, excuse you say, like in Ghana would set up an institution all the way in Tamale. What for? If it's for commercial purposes or something, it will be in Accra. But thinking, beyond that kind of, uh, repetitive history of arts being in those kind of centers, it presented all these opportunities where now you have Tamale being a hub where farmers, head potters, people from different walks of life could come and experience art to contribute to it. And it's not only just art, but it also brings in a lot of things where now how do you call it, in terms of education, the school kids also come and for the first time, instead of seeing plane in the skies, now they're interacting, they are in planes, and they are having lectures in the planes, learning about drones, all these technology, and all these technologies that probably they would not have had access to because of a certain form of structure. So these are ways in which it's impacting into lives, and so many people. We work with carpenters, we work with, and is yeah, so these are some of the things that it's something that is growing. Of course, there might be, how do you call it, failures and things, but we keep learning, and to also be presented with working in unfinished buildings and all of that. It entirely changes what art is and how you even think about. Now you are showing in this kind of space, and you're dealing with how your work is going to interact with the space, because it's not an easy space to work with. It's not like you put a work there, then it automatically works. Now this is a very challenging space, and these are the things that we keep pushing. Of course, when it comes to arts institutions and its impact in the communities as well, and expanding the notions of what art could be. Yeah.
I mean,
Something that
yeah.
she said. There was, yeah, a eaten from like bolted nuts and things like that. Like with regards to the Elizabeth and her team had their decision to work with this space. Of course, curatorially, it was very difficult to make some choices with regards to the building lights and all that. Yeah, but that's the point, you know. This is not like an institution which is designed to show art. So there are a lot of choices that you have to make. There are a lot of challenges. Some things work, some things will not work. For instance, as in the case of, let's say, Francois' work, there are some things that basically might not work, but it's part of the work itself. So the artist or architect has to understand that fundamentally the conditions within a given space also affects the work in terms of the forms that are produced within it. So in the case of blaxTARLINES, that is the foundation of because in many art schools you don't they teach you with the idea of art. I guess I've been having this conversation with some of your students like Carmen and Anna about the disaster of, let's say, trying to teach an artist or an architect using a template of art and architecture. It's a complete disaster. You know, the idea of teaching them what a sets of conditions or sets of conditions, or even using the failure as a starting point to be able to teach them to think that there are a multitude of forms that can emerge out of something. It doesn't always have to be something that is utilitarian, something that we can use or derive something out of. But as long as it can contribute towards a certain sense of meaning to life in the world and beyond, that is where there is promise in a way that humankind or other life forms can somehow experience what we make. And blaxTARLINES, at least with the generation of professors from caricature who, like when we were students, when they were teaching that, it begins to somehow create this new sense of emancipation in a way that the artist begins to think. Because how does an artist produce? How does an artist produce if he knows that he has nothing, like he's starting from ground zero, and whatever he's producing is meant to be consumed by everyone, everything. Yeah, if you were a farmer who was growing crops, and you knew that your crops was not just meant to be harvested to be sold in the market, but also locusts, caterpillars, grasshopper, like insects were all part of the infestation, like the process of what kind of farming would that be? And I think that is then a perfect explanation or a way of thinking about the blaxTARLINES model in terms of what it presents to the thinking of art and its production.
Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating that all your artistic manifestations, let's say, or projects manifest very specifically and individually, but you all have in common that you allow for open-ended processes and also allow for like losing ultimate control, which is also what was of interest to us on a theoretical level in curating this exhibition. And like also referring to what you said, reminds me also like going back to the institution building, if I name it like that, you do that in your work. It was always it was very inclusive always and not exclusive, which is very rare still in the arts sector in a West African context, but also a global context. And so that the inclusiveness for a while was in the process of the making of your art, and now it's in the audience you try to reach in Tamale.
Yeah, I guess it's important because what's the point at the end of the day? Because in studying modern art and the art forms, genres that came before it, there was so much exclusivity within it, even in the way that it was made. So even when we started doing the drone workshops in Tamale, we mostly focused on the females, like the girls who were in the community. Recently, I was having a conversation with my colleague Selom. There was an artist who came to Tamale and wanted to learn about drone tech. So Selom was trying to get one of the girls in the community to teach her, demonstrate, so that it was very important to him. But somehow she had almost forgotten she needed time to get back into it. So for us, it's very important. And these are people coming from very ordinary very humble communities and backgrounds. And for me, it was very important that the notion of having to decentralize the idea of art that could manifest on a very high level. So, for instance, in the case of the recent exhibitions that we are doing, it's a collaboration with the Danish institution Aarhus, and we've also collaborated with the Ghana Museums and Monuments Board and brought in objects that have never been seen beyond Accra before. So now you have, let's say, the work of Olafur Eliassen or all these like Jasper Jas and like all these artists, like video works, really sophisticated work in this community, where it's just an ordinary farming community. So sometimes you are at Red Clay and you have, let's say, farmers who have just come close from the farm with their hoes and cutlass. It's just going through, as Tracy was saying, and they come to the institution and casually they're just passing, they're just looking at Olafur Eliassen's work. And casually, the security man who happens, we educate all of them on the exhibitions. So the security man who is speaking the local language, Dagbani, is taking the community members through the exhibition and explaining the work of Olafur Eliassen. This, it's almost like it's a miracle. It's not meant to happen or meant to be. It's the same with the silo. Like a few days before I left, we were at the top of the silo, and we had these kids coming there. Traditionally, for decades, no one wanted to go to the silo, and if they went there, excuse my language, they only went there to defecate, you know. So the kids only had that relationship with the building and also the myth surrounding the building. So now that it's an institution, they are coming to the space, and I said, do you know about this space? And they said, yes, we know about it. Of course, they know it to be what it was. So I'm like, what do you know it to be now? And they say, we know it to be a zoo. Of course, I laughed in the beginning, but it was exciting because the idea of a zoo is not just a place where animals are kept to be watched, but the idea of a zoo, because we're thinking about all these ecological. So when they said a zoo, the ecologies was the thing that came into mind. I was really, really excited, and we're happy to show them a zoo which doesn't have animals in cages, but like Sputniks and like bats that are living freely, and yeah, they could be stained by their pee or their poo or things. So for us, for art to be able to be truly democratic, we have to be able to go a step further by properly intervening within institutional models and structures, review what really makes art in itself. Because if we're going to rely on the 20th century models of production of art and also the form that art takes and architecture itself, we will continue living in a certain loop, and it will be a complete disaster. We'll never really get anywhere in terms of like pushing the boundaries of experience when it comes to culture around the world.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pity that we don't have a live audience now to pose questions, but I would like to invite everyone who's not here today to visit the show. So this is up until October, and so besides the work of Tracy and Ibrahim, there is a wonderful work by Ghanaian photographer and artist Eric Yamfi. Then we have a video work by Uriel Orloff. We have Susanne Wenger in this space, and New Territories, François Roche, as well as Meling Loco. So I think we close now. It was a pleasure having you here the whole week, and it was almost magic that we managed this in the COVID times, and we hope for a big physical audience here over the next days and weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you very much.